Good evening and welcome, everybody. Can you hear me at the back? My name's Brian Furness. I'm not a scientist, but I'm a sort of fossil physician. I used to work at the ANU Health Service, and Tom and I and his father were neighbours of ours when I first moved to Canberra, and Tom's father was the first consultant physician in Canberra half a century ago. So I think it's appropriate that I should chair this important meeting of Tom's on artificial photosynthesis. Tom is a true polymath. You know what a polymath is? Somebody who knows something about everything, really. It's the opposite of somebody with tunnel vision. And Tom graduated both in law at the ANU and medicine at Newcastle. And he achieved distinction in both fields since he qualified. His PhD thesis on the Human Genome Project was awarded the Crawford Prize for the best thesis in all fields at the ANU in 1991. His experience ranges from intensive care medicine to public health problems to human rights and the ethics of whistleblowing. He's been awarded an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship to study nanotechnology and global public health. I'm not a physicist, but I think nanotechnology means quite small particles. Tom is also an applied psychologist because he launched the first World Conference on Artificial Photosynthesis. Guess where he chose for the venue? Lord Howe Island. So anybody who likes snorkeling, how could they resist an invitation to attend and give a paper there? Tom and I share an interest in environmental health and sustainability as we march forward from the Anthropocene, hopefully, to the Sustainocene. So I now invite Tom, if he wants to give a little talk to us about global artificial photosynthesis and sustainability.
Thanks very much, Brian, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land. Today I'm talking to you about something that I feel quite passionate about, and that's creating a sustainable world. And Brian mentioned the concept of the Sustainocene quite appropriately because he developed the concept that we're headed into a Sustainocene. And as you'll see in the presentation I'm about to develop, the Sustainocene is a period of human habitation of Earth and human dominance of the Earth, which, if it is to be ethical, should last for the same length of time as the legacy that life has given us, which means we're planning for a period of over 1 billion years, short of asteroid impacts, of humans inhabiting the planet and looking after it. And the purpose of this talk is to talk about how wonderful new technology may help us live sustainably in that world. So we've just in Australia moved through the hectic debate of establishing a carbon price. Many other nations, as you'll see in the presentation, are headed in the same direction. And I guess the big public policy questions associated with that are just how far will a carbon price go? Placing a mechanism for redistributing investment from what some have called archived photosynthesis or old photosynthesis fuels towards new renewable forms of energy. Will this really deliver us a Sustainocene, a hydrogen fuel-based economy, and will it allow us to actually absorb CO2 from areas of concentration such as smokestacks or even from dilute sources in the air and make fuels with that? So this talk involves a series of hypotheses, and these are the practical hypotheses that are involved. And one is that Global artificial photosynthesis is the moral culmination of nanotechnology. This is a book I've written, as you'll see in the talk, on that topic. That the thesis I'm developing there is that nanotechnology, this wonderful new enabling and transformative technology, is being used for a lot of specious usages at the moment. Socks and shirts that don't smell, better golf clubs, sunscreens that are a little bit clear so they're not white. These all seem to me to be wasting the great potential of nanotechnology. So one way of solving this is to create some sort of macro science project which demonstrates to the global public that nanotechnology is capable of addressing the great public health and environmental problems of our time. And not only that, but moving us forward into a sustainable future. The second hypothesis is that global collaborations will facilitate that. And the third hypothesis is that although those collaborations may evolve spontaneously, they can be accelerated if we manage to address some of the main governance challenges that will be facing this area, and some of them are listed on the screen there. Now, some more esoteric hypotheses, and this is, I guess, because in an evening like this, you get a variety of different people coming to a presentation with a variety of interests, and I always think that if you're presenting research, you want to come from a bit more of a rich philosophical foundation. So these are more esoteric hypotheses. So those of you who aren't into esoteric hypotheses can zone out for a few moments, and those who are can hopefully stay with me for a while. The first is that there can be true statements about reality that don't correlate with common sense. That's a fundamental insight that physics has drawn upon to achieve great breakthroughs, and you'll see some of these discussed. I think I've thought for a while that Einstein probably developed that understanding from reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason when he was young, because in that book it's made quite clear that time and space are a priori concepts that develop prior to our sensory experience. And you'll see that this insight has significant impacts in governance systems. And that's hypothesis 6, that governance systems, particularly idealist ones like international human rights law and the sort of governance systems that are being employed to create a sustainable world, are also positing a reality that doesn't necessarily correlate immediately with common sense, but is nonetheless true and real. The seventh hypothesis is that virtue in both individuals and societies is acquired by the consistent application of universally applicable principles in the face of obstacles. And this is, again, a Kantian conception, but I think it's a very accurate one. Universally applicable principles means they're capable of applying to all particular stakeholders rather than a particular class. And you can see that if you hold on to an idea like that in governance systems, then you support whistleblowers and these people who apply principles in the face of obstacles. So it's an ethical statement about how not just societies but individuals should respond to certain challenges. The next hypothesis is that the moral evolution of humanity is a reality. You wonder why you want to challenge that, but some people really do believe we're just a bunch of self-replicating molecules fighting for existence amongst ourselves. But if we believe that there is a sort of moral evolution of humanity, and not necessarily linking it with the Enlightenment sort of idea, but the idea that we're progressing to something good, then it's driven by a widening sympathy, which takes the form of both internal, which is moral, and external, which is legal, constraints upon how we behave. And the last hypothesis is that that type of widening sympathy can be supported by widespread use of technological innovation. And I think as we'll see in this presentation, the great governance shift that will take place in our lifetimes is that the great human-centred social virtues like justice and equality, alongside them will stand non-anthropocentric virtues like environmental sustainability. And that will be a huge shift in human sympathy to actually, it's sort of a Copernican revolution in governance understanding, that we actually prioritise the interests of biosphere and animals and other creatures equally with ourselves. And as we'll see, there are steps that are being taken in that direction already that bear directly upon how we use this wonderful new technology, nanotechnology, to power a sustainable future. So the Anthropocene, I won't spend too much time on this. I hope this is a very short-lived period of human history. Of course, it's not technically a period, a geophysical period at the moment. We're technically in the Holocene, but I think a lot of people are now saying, forget the Holocene, look around you, we're in the Anthropocene. You know, the ice caps are melting, the smog from the cities is basically covering the entire planet, the fisheries are being depleted. You know, to say that we're not actually altering to a significant extent the actual way that people live on the planet can't be correct. And researchers, including some of those at this particular university, have been developing benchmarks or safe boundaries in the understanding of how we interfere with our planet. And you can see some of them mentioned there, the way in which we interfere with the atmospheric greenhouse gases, the way we interfere with biological diversity, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, biodiversity. And instead, we have 5 Ps, and this idea was one of Brian's from his presentation, that the Anthropocene is characterised by these 5 Ps. Population, overpopulation. We're approaching 10 billion people. Poverty, even though we have this wonderful technology, we still manage to somehow organise a global system where a significant proportion of the people in the world are actually hungry and dying from starvation. Preparation for war. The fact that a large proportion of the developed economies in the world are actually supported by preparation for war and killing people and selling arms and munitions. And that a large number of the stakeholders that are influencing global policy are purely and chiefly motivated by profit and pollution. That's one of the characteristic features of our species. So when people look back on the Anthropocene, that's what they'll be looking back. So really it'll be very hard to say if these are correct, and I think there's a good case that these things are characteristic features, that this speaks very well for us as a species. And so at the same time, people are trying to develop safe planetary boundaries that will actually manage to cope with the situation of us as a species approaching 10 billion people by 2050, and our energy use going up from about 400 to over 500 exajoules a year in that period. And of course, there is this vast amount of energy available from the sun, the safe nuclear reactor out in space. And so this presentation, this particular slide, gives you an idea of the amount of energy. Say if you look at the global energy consumption as a rough estimate and then compare it to the amount of solar energy that's available, this is the first principles thinking that are leading people to suggest that surely solar power has to be part of a sustainable future. That we have to start thinking about, if we're thinking about it from first principles, about the sun powering our future. Which leads us to this. This is a slide that I acknowledge was led to me by Professor Kemia, who published this in a paper in Nature last year. And this is the famous 1.9 angstrom resolution of PS2, which is at the heart of the photosynthetic process. Now, this is important because I think the greatest invention of life has been photosynthesis. Much more important, I think, than DNA in the passing on hereditary characteristics. The capacity to actually grab solar energy and then store it in chemical bonds through the splitting of water was a fantastic invention. And then coupling that with the capacity to absorb carbon dioxide and mix that with the energy that you got to produce starches. I mean, those bacteria, you know, given the evolutionary process, it was a fantastic invention. And we'll get to the significance of that in a governance sense towards the end of the paper. But the importance of this slide is that research is now at the point of being able to fully characterise at a molecular level exactly how photosynthesis works. And the important step that I think that gives us, or the important preparation that gives us, is it means that we can then start to improve and not just replicate, but improve upon that process. And that's the exciting sort of cutting edge point that we're at with photosynthesis now. And it's exciting a lot of the researchers that have been working in photosynthesis for ages, such as Warwick Hillier sitting in the audience there. So this is the structure. I mean, I guess you always see these sort of slides and you wonder what's all this about, particularly those of you who aren't chemically oriented. The thing that I'd like you to remember that you might stick in your mind is this sort of shape here. You see, it looks like one of those sort of weird Van Gogh chairs, you know, those sort of chairs that people sit on in Van Gogh paintings. That can't be geometrically right, you know, because it's going to fall over. It's a sort of cubane structure. And the interesting thing about that is that although this structure, this is the way the oxygen atoms arrange themselves around the manganese in the photosynthetic process, seems to be replicated in a lot of the artificial catalysts that people are developing, like cobalt. So it's an intriguing question about why this particular configuration seems to be at the heart of photosynthesis. So those sort of symbolic things are sort of quite interesting. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is sort of, but essentially, there is a good first principles reason to think that we are moving towards a global hydrogen economy. Yes, hydrogen requires 3,000 times more space than gasoline for the equivalent amount of energy, but on a weight basis, it's had 3 times the energy content of gasoline. That's sort of 120 compared with, say, 44 megajoules a kilogram. But it's a very complex process to actually prepare hydrogen in a sort of form in which you can use it as a fuel. It takes a lot of fossil fuel energy to do that. A lot of energy is lost, but on the other hand, hydrogen is not a greenhouse gas, and if you can compress it and then use it and burn it, you get water. And you can get cheap forms of hydrogen by splitting water using sunlight. So there are some good first principles reasons to think that photosynthesis and in an artificial form can drive us towards a hydrogen economy, which has a lot of benefits, at least in first principles sense. Similarly, the CO2 absorption is an important part of the puzzle. Obviously, we've got to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have to organise CO2 drawdown is the sort of technical term. And there's various techniques that you may have heard about in terms of geosequestration and other sort of scrubbing techniques to get CO2 out. Wouldn't it be great if we were actually able to do this like plants do? And I guess my sort of vision, which you'll see as we go on, is that one day every single building, road, bridge, vehicle will be doing photosynthesis using artificial technology or using nanotechnology. And in that sense, you'll have a sustainable world, because instead of looking around now and seeing plants doing photosynthesis, and then in between the plants are all these bits of concrete and bricks which aren't doing anything. They're not contributing to the environment. They're not absorbing CO2. They're not making oxygen. They're not making their own fuel. They're sort of like parasitic structures. I mean, they're helpful for us as human beings, but they're not really helpful for anything else, except pigeons, maybe you can roost on them, and various other critters that can hide in them. But, you know, they're leaching out the lime and stuff from the concrete into the foundations. Really, these sort of buildings, people will look back and think, you know, well, that was characteristic of the Anthropocene. Just thinking about yourselves. Building buildings that weren't actually contributing to the biosphere. Well, hopefully, with artificial photosynthesis, those sort of buildings may become a thing of the past. And so some people have said that in the interim, once we get artificial photosynthesis going, once we get a cheap source of hydrogen from splitting water, which is H2O, to give hydrogen and oxygen, and we've managed to get carbon dioxide, either from dilute or concentrated sources, then we could put them together and make fuels like methanol. And books have been written, such as this, the one by Ola here, about, you know, we're actually headed towards, at least in the interim, a methanol economy. Problem with that, of course, is that methanol is quite toxic. And if you start sticking it into this, you know, ground storage stations of gasoline and it starts leaching into the water table, it's not such a good thing. But nevertheless, there's the idea that we can actually start making fuels by bringing the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen together, at least in the short term, may solve a lot of the problems, at least initially, with being able to use hydrogen as a fuel. So let's have a quick look at artificial photosynthesis. I won't spend too much on this, but it starts off with a nuclear reactor at a very safe distance, right? Not in my backyard, right? Which is the sun, of course, you know, ideally placed by the cosmos and at a perfect distance away from us. Then you have light harvesting. And I know because we have a lot of solar energy people it's quite annoying to them, but I disregard all the people who are doing solar cells. There's the light harvesting component of artificial photosynthesis. So Andrew Blakers and all these other people say, well, you know, that's very good. Keep working on the light harvesting part of artificial photosynthesis, because that's really the future. Then they got the electron transfer. So you grab the electrons from the sun, There they come down. Remember, this is the interesting thing with quantum coherence, is they all travelling down these multiple pathways. They find the fastest one and they collapse into the fastest pathway, right? As Feynman would have said. A lot of people are working on this sort of quantum coherence component of electron transfer as something that's going to significantly increase the efficiency of artificial photosynthesis. So they all are zapping around, plasmonic resonance, various other things, going to the reaction centre, which is going to be, say, modelled on the version I showed you before with those fine-grained pictures, or other forms of catalysts with that cubane structure, right? Splitting off. So you're getting oxidative catalysis there and reductive catalysis. So now I'm going to take you into a very quick survey of some slides that have been lent to me by people, colleagues in various aspects of artificial photosynthesis, describing some of the structures and the different approaches. So there are molecular approaches, there are nanotechnology approaches. A lot of people work in the biological side from either genetic engineering or synthetic biology contributing to artificial photosynthesis. So here's some of the various sort of problems and technical approaches, one particular way of looking at it. This is Dan Nocera from MIT, although he's moving to Harvard now. He's in many ways was a pace setter with his cobalt catalyst and quite good turnover rates. And if you go to presentations that he does overseas, you'll see that he drops his particular device in a jar of water, shines one sun on it, and you can see the hydrogen bubbling off and the oxygen bubbling off. So he's developing a practical device, and this is where the field is at the moment. All the grants are sort of organised towards practical devices. This is the approach of Stenborn-Steyring's Solar H2 group at Uppsala. I won't spend too much time. Michael Greitzel, who many of you will know, won international kudos for the development of the Greitzel dye-sensitive solar cell, is now working on doped iron oxide as a catalyst. And really there are sort of three catalysts I think that are around. Manganese, which is what plants use. And really, if you're doing a life cycle analysis, you'd put your money on manganese because it's less likely to be toxic at a global level. Cobalt, which Nocera's group is using, and there is a lot of cobalt around. There are big nodules of it in the sea and so forth. But would you want cobalt sort of spread around the world globally? Sure. And doped iron oxide, or sort of rust. You think, yeah, well, okay, that could work as well. Those are the three main, and there are a lot of other different mechanisms as well, but those are some of them. So here's a sort of device that, say, Nocera's group was coming up with, trying to develop some sort of practical device that you could imagine, in some ways, simple vision would be you've got your normal solar panel grabbing the photons, and instead of just running it off into the grid, you've got another sort of wire coming across into a unit, which is then converting it into a fuel, either by absorbing CO2 and mixing it, or doing some sort of storage operation. So now a quick survey, having just briefly gone over, just to give you, I hope those of you with a scientific background were able to sort of quickly absorb all those bits and pieces, but I understand I'm talking to a wide audience here with some people who have scientific backgrounds and some don't, so I certainly don't want to bore you by going into all the details. But what I'm now going to present is a survey of the major groups that are working on artificial photosynthesis, because one of the questions that people say is, oh, this is very abstract, it's artificial, how far down the track are they, who's doing this? Well, the answer is that almost every developed nation has a major solar fuels hub working at the moment, driving ahead, working in this field. The biggest one is probably the Joint Centre on Artificial Photosynthesis at Berkeley. So this is a slide Pidong Yang gave me. I gave a presentation there earlier this year. They received $120 million from Obama to basically drive ahead the solar fuels agenda. Nate Lewis is the director. They've got a particular approach that they're using, and they're set on producing a practical device within 2 to 3 years. That's their goal. And they're working as a sort of a link between Caltech at Pasadena and Berkeley, and they have some daily conferences to work on this. Here are some of the European groups that have major solar fuels projects. So remember, we're talking about solar fuels. We're not talking about solar cells and solar electricity going into the grid. These are groups that are designed to actually grab solar energy and convert that into liquid fuels. And so you can see there's a lot of groups working throughout Europe on this. These are some of the groups that are working around the world. Korea, Sogang University is the major project. Japan at Osaka University in particular. China at Dalian. You'll see Singapore at Nanyang University. Brazil, Australia's groups working on it. You see most of the developed world have now got major projects working on solar fuels. Now there's a moral imperative to this, I guess, some of you may be aware of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, reducing poverty, increasing the amount of people who have access to basic sources of power for heating and cooking, reducing childhood mortality and living in slums. All of these things, power and energy, are required to do. And in some ways, the use of nanotechnology to help do this, particularly through artificial photosynthesis, when there's a strong role of nanotechnology there, both in sort of light capture in particular, is a form of planetary nanomedicine. So in a sense, you've got the Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis of the planet as a sort of individual, and I think people are now thinking, well, if it's an individual, it's a patient. It's pretty sick, and it's not necessarily going to self-regulate. And as the stewards of this world, we should come up with a therapeutic, and I think the therapeutic is artificial photosynthesis. And again, you can think that through from first principles, because photosynthesis is what gave us the atmosphere. It gave us the food, the energy that we burn now, the oil, coal, natural gas, all of that's photosynthesis. So we're running our world on ancient archived photosynthesis. We're running it on a legacy, a debt that we have to repay. And so when you think of it in that sort of context from first principles, as I did, the answer is artificial photosynthesis. But there is a very poor understanding of artificial photosynthesis. We got students from 5 of the major Australian high schools to come to the conference we ran at Lord Howe Island that Brian mentioned. One of the first things one of the groups said was, artificial photosynthesis is a wrong term, right? Artificial, it just sounds fake, false. You've got to come up with something else, like improved or better photosynthesis or something like this. So there's a large chance that particularly the way that the sort of press that nanotechnology has at the moment is that unless it's properly explained, people may resist the idea of artificial photosynthesis. And people will say, well, what are you going to do? Replace trees with plastic trees or these sorts of things, rather than understanding that once you have buildings and roads and bridges doing photosynthesis more efficiently than plants, then it takes the pressure off the natural world. And this is, to me, one of the big advances that we're going to see. Just as we saw, for example, at the development of machines, steam engines, took the pressure off slaves, needing slaves, and the ideals of all people being created equal were able to blossom because technology allowed us to move into that space. I think it'll be the same thing with environmental sustainability. Once we're actually able, through our own buildings, to generate basic foods and energy and water, then the idea that the ecosystem can have its rights and stay separate, people will say, well, fine, because we don't need to trespass on their territory anymore. So the other point is, though, that the problems we're facing in terms of climate change and water security, food security, energy security, give us a very short time frame in which to address whether or not we're going to take up a challenge like artificial photosynthesis and solve it. Because although these big teams are working on it, they could take several decades to work it all through. Are we just going to sit back and watch them slowly work their way through this problem? Or should we start to focus our energies and say, this is, we're putting our money on this. This is what we should do, not another Large Hadron Collider, right? Not another Hubble Space Telescope. We need to sort of focus on the main game, which is the potential collapse of the biosphere. So we have a window of opportunity to get something like global artificial photosynthesis going, and we can't assume that we'll have another window of opportunity and another one. This may be it, right? The only chance we have to get something like this going. And at the moment, it's really not in the policy space. If you look at energy policy documents, you just don't see solar fuels or artificial photosynthesis, maybe a paragraph here or a paragraph there. In fact, it's been quite depressing talking to policymakers at national and international levels about their lack of understanding of artificial photosynthesis. A lot of people haven't even heard of it. So let's go quickly through this. Some of you will know we have a carbon price in Australia. It's now been linked to the European carbon market, and there is a huge global market in carbon trading. So the idea that somehow this could be resisted and turned back is really sort of silly, because it's just something that the rest of the world is doing. Again, it makes sense from first principles, right? Doesn't it? It's a true statement about reality that doesn't necessarily correlate with common sense, but it does correlate with common sense as well. Think about it. So the European Union, and this is just one example, is starting to develop policy plans for the development of low carbon technologies and ensure their widespread take-up. So you're starting to see energy policy documents heading in this direction, where they're looking for some sort of technology like artificial photosynthesis. Even the United States is heading in this direction, although obviously it's got particular constraints due to the powerful interests of the archived photosynthesis lobby in that country. One of the reasons that Stephen Chu, the Energy Secretary of State in the US, pulled out of the hydrogen production roadmap is that it was simply too expensive to make hydrogen in terms of carbon emissions. But once you see hydrogen as being produced efficiently and cheaply on a large scale by splitting water, that problem evaporates. Now in Australia, as a result of the carbon price, one of the most intriguing things that there should be a large amount of money available through various sources for clean energy projects, which hopefully won't be solar electricity all the time. One of the most frustrating things for researchers in this field is that every time someone talks about some new grant and they say, well, let's build a new solar collector or something, we'll say, no, there are other areas of research about renewable energy than just building huge solar collectors, even though it's very good that Canberra is going to have one of these things. So the problem is, with this is if the carbon price isn't high enough, the challenge is that it won't actually incentivise venture capital to start moving into challenging areas like this. And obviously, to get these sort of things going, you need a mixture of public and private finance. And so the carbon price, if that's going to be the trigger, has to be at the right level. And this is what the concern was with getting rid of the floor price recently and connecting it to the European one. Similarly, there's a large risk of corporate fraud. A lot of people have already said that with the trading permit system going on in Europe, there's a lot of fraud going on. That people are cooking up false certificates and making false claims about carbon reduction in order to get access to these large pots of money. You'd expect this. It's normal sort of corporate behaviour. But you need to find, regulators. You need to find a system to deal with this, and I think I have, and I'll mention it, shortly. And continuous technological improvements in a nascent field like solar fuels requires stable and certain incentive laws. So let's have a look at some of these governance problems. Right, so there's a variety of sort of different problems that are going to arise with trying to get artificial photosynthesis into energy roadmaps. And this is important because it's got to get into these roadmaps, because this is what drives government funding and government policy. At the moment, it's off the radar. Carbon dioxide reduction is not really considered in the context of photosynthesis. The European Union and the Department of Energy in the US, which are the two main funders in this area, don't regularly meet and correlate, so that often you get duplication of projects going on. There's a whole stack of other problems. The smart grid, which is the concept where you can have decentralised energy coming into a grid, and then the grid itself realises that it's getting energy from these decentralised renewable sources and can immediately either offload excess energy to other systems. That's easier in Europe or something, for example. You can just send it to other countries that don't have it. In Australia, it's harder. How do you actually start slowing down coal-fired power stations when you've got too much renewable energy? This is the whole challenge of the smart grid. But then the whole idea that you can have off-grid energy solutions isn't on the energy radar. And that's strange, because when you look at our economy, something like only 40% of the energy is actually electricity. 60% is fuel in airplanes, cars, trucks. That's all fuel. It's not electricity. So we actually sort of need to have a more systematic understanding of how we can drive renewable energy in all sorts of sectors rather than just electricity. Now, here we come to some of the major challenges that trying to roll out a Sustaincoene using artificial photosynthesis and the vision that I outlined is going to face. And one of these is investor-state dispute settlement provisions, such as those in the Energy Charter Treaty, which you'll see mentioned there. And these sort of provisions, and you'll see them in bilateral investment treaties, BITs. They're trying to be incorporated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that we're strangely somehow negotiating now with the United States, Canada and Mexico, which have these provisions. These provisions allow foreign corporations to to sue governments that make decisions that they think undermine their investments. Now, that's a very broad challenge. It means they don't have to go through the rule of law processes in our country, which I think is deleterious because we spent a lot of time investing in a non-corrupt judiciary and a sound rule of law. And then you allow these corporations to say, well, we'll just bypass that and go to these panel of 3 trade arbitrators who will just look at a very narrowly defined trade or investment agreement and decide whether or not a country which is trying to, say, develop renewable energy or develop some policies oriented around sustainability has to pay vast amounts of compensation. So here are some of the criticisms of investor-state dispute settlement. Many people, academics, are calling it rogue law at the behest of multinational corporations. Why would you call it rogue law? People say, oh, that's an emotive term. Well, the reason it's rogue law is that we have in any particular society, remember that at the beginning of the talk I said virtue is acquired by the consistent application of principle in the face of obstacles. That's what a society does if it wants to be considered just or equitable. When people look back and they say, that's how we treated asylum seekers, justly, equitably, right? Thus we're an equitable and just society, right? We built up, these sorts of laws about looking after various underprivileged components of our people in our society. That's why we're a just and equitable society. Now, the problem with investor-state dispute settlement is it doesn't have to look at any of those documents. It doesn't have to look at the national constitution. It doesn't have to look at international agreements or human rights agreements. For example, Uruguay is suing Australia before the World Trade Organization because of plain packaging of cigarettes. Now, I don't know how much trade between Australia and Uruguay and cigarettes there is, but essentially it's Uruguay working at the behest of Philip Morris, right? The 3 trade investment arbitrators who will be hearing that dispute don't even have to look at the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is at the basis of the Australian legislation. They don't even have to think about it. And yet that international agreement and our obligation to enforce its provisions is at the heart of our legislation. Now, that's why you'd call investor-state dispute settlement rogue law. It's not law that's part of a social contract. It's not taking into account all the other considerations. It's a particular type of law which is suiting the interests of multinational corporations, which by their constitution are required to maximise shareholder profit. And I've said for ages that one of the big reforms we need to develop is to somehow get corporations married. Because at the moment they're narcissistic individuals who are just focused on, imagine if you had a friend like that, all thinking about profit, and you sit down at the dinner table and you say, well, that's my profit, that's my profit. You say, can't you talk about something else of my profit? You say, you'd be trying to arrange dates for the person, wouldn't you? And say, why don't you go out and see a film, get married, have some children. Then you'll suddenly realise that there are other things. Now, the only way you can get corporations to do that is put something in their registration. Make it a condition of their annual registration that they do some public good. And if they don't do it, they don't get registered. Things like this. These are sort of ideas that we need to think about. So here are some examples of how investor-state dispute settlement is actually affecting the rollout of renewable energies. And in a sense, you can segue from this and think about how this is going to affect solar fuels. You'll see here that a Texas-based power group served Canada with an investor-state dispute settlement claim under the North American Free Trade Agreement in connection with Ontario's feed-in tariff scheme to encourage solar fuels. Similarly, the same program was challenged by Japan and the European Union under a World Trade Organization agreement related to imposing content performance requirements, despite the fact that there are supposed to be exceptions for protecting the environment. Spain has been challenged under the Energy Charter Treaty, which I just mentioned, by 14 investors because of its cuts to solar energy tariffs. So you can see it can cut both ways. You can use these sort of investor-state things to actually support renewable energy or go against it. And similarly, you can see that the Italian government and the Czech government have also been involved in investor-state disputes, specifically over energy and their policies about energy. The Canadian mining company Pacific Rim, this is another example, commenced an action before the International Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes against El Salvador, demanding $77 million in compensation because of the government's denial of a permit for gold mining project because of strong public concerns that that project would contaminate the water for half the country. But they still want $77 million for compensation, even though they're admitting that, yes, it would contaminate the water, but still it's our investment, right? And you're undercutting our investment. And if you look at the terms of the investment treaty, that's what we want to decide. Now, one of the reasons people like myself really dislike this system is that these arbitrators have a vested interest in fighting for the corporations, because only corporations bring these cases. The arbitrators are paid by the hour. They can be advocates in one case, and they can be judges or people on the panel in the next case. They don't have to keep a record of their decisions. They don't have to make their decisions referable to all the other normative frameworks in which legal representatives at the international and national level must work. So that's why, in a sense, they are rogue jurists at the service of multinational corporations. Now, how can we get around this? Well, one sort of sleeping right that I'm starting to look at is Article 15B of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which most nations in the world are parties to. And that recognises the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. So then you think, okay, so we've got this right under international law. States at the end of the year have to justify to the United Nations how they've gone about implementing that right. Would this justify greater flexibilities in a broader normative framework to be considered by dispute settlement under World Trade Organisation, bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements? In other words, you could drive a broader normative agenda into the heart of the WTO. I've said for ages that the WTO should merge with the United Nations Human Rights Organisation. And once that happens, then you've got a sound organisation. In other words, you marry the WTO. Could you imagine that? All the people from the WTO getting all dressed up, and all the people from the United Nations Human Rights Organisation, and you have a marriage. And they take vows and get together. And I think everybody would be happy. They said, now we have they might fight with each other a bit. But you see, essentially out of that, you'd have a much sounder governance system. Would something like this help justify a tax on global financial transactions? And I've had debates with economists at numerous events over whether or not it's possible to have a tax on global financial transactions. And of course it is. It just has to be done through an international treaty. You have to get a lot of countries to do it at once so that investors can't sort of cherry pick the system. But again, from first principles, about true statements about reality, of course there has to be a tax on global financial transactions. We have a tax on our transactions. Every time we put a bit of plastic into a teller machine, $2 gets shimmied off. Why shouldn't the same thing be happening to these corporations that are just shifting money around the world with computers often? And this is interesting in terms of rights and protecting the rights of the environment. A few weeks ago, an agreement was signed between the Wanganui River Maori Trust and the New Zealand Crown in Parliament, under which a river in New Zealand was given the status of being a person. Now that's not any different than a corporation. Corporations are people, but it means that the guardians of that corporation can sue on its behalf and protect its interests in the courts. So if someone comes along and tries to trash it or pollute it, they don't have to wait for the environmental regulator to be contacted and all that sort of circuitous process. These people can just lodge a statement of claim through their lawyers and sue the hell out of whoever's trespassing on their river. So again, remember we spoke about the shift in governance that we're facing now between justice and equity as great human-centred virtues and respect for human dignity. Respect for human dignity. These are at the heart of the international human rights movement, and for a long time lawyers have thought this was the apotheosis of idealism in a governance sense, international human rights. Well, what's happening now is the rights of nature. The non-anthropocentric rights of nature are creeping up as an equally important social virtue, right? Environmental sustainability, and these are examples. In 2008, Ecuador, yes, I know, which already has great kudos around the world from many people for supporting that Aussie whistleblower, what's his name? Anyway, the one is holed up, it's just that, if you don't want to mention his name too much. Ecuador became the first country to recognise legally enforceable rights of nature in its constitution. Isn't that great? I think that's real kudos to be able to say we were the first to recognise rights, because are they going to be the last? No, I can tell you, if you come back here in a time machine, or you manage to regrow your organs, or or various, you fix up your telomerase and various other techniques, and you're still around here in 500 years, and we're still around as a species, which is problematic, you'll see that most constitutions, if not all of them, will have legally enforceable rights of nature written into them. And similarly, if you look up your global jurisprudence or planetary jurisprudence on the web, you'll see that those planetary safe boundaries that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there are now moves to incorporate those in legally binding international law agreements. So getting towards the end. This is another important point. Photosynthesis is the common heritage of humanity. A lot of you will know that the human genome, the deep sea bed, outer space, moon, world cultural and natural heritage have common heritage claims under United Nations, the declarations and conventions. And I think we've reached the point now, particularly with the increased characterisation of photosynthesis at a molecular level and the capacity to reproduce it, to declare photosynthesis, at least in its molecular form, the common heritage of humanity, meaning that we should have an obligation under international law to pass it on to future generations so they can research it and take benefits from it without it being parcelled up by individual interests or even used for military purposes. And so these are some of the characteristics of something that's declared common heritage of humanity. You can't use it to make weapons. You have to preserve it for future generations. Representatives of all nations should manage it equitably. I can't see why we won't be moving towards declaring photosynthesis and artificial photosynthesis common heritage in the near future, and that will be a significant governance shift towards the Sustainocene. Another point that I'm developing under a separate Australian Research Council grant relates to the fraud that I mentioned is likely to occur under these renewable energy schemes and climate schemes. Remember corporations finding false certificates? Well, I think the best mechanism to get around that is to draw upon the virtue. Remember we spoke about whistleblowers at the beginning of the talk as people who were consistently applying universally applicable principles in the face of obstacles. Well, the best thing to do is not just expect them to do that without financial reward, but to incentivise them by giving financial reward if they reveal information on fraud. And this is the US False Claims Act. It's very successful. It gives whistleblowers 15 to 30% of the triple damages the government gets when that information reveals fraud. So some of these whistleblowers end up with $100 million. Yes, it does take 10 years. Yes, there's no guarantee they'll get it. Yes, there are all sorts of provisions to weed out false and vexatious claims, but it's a very, very effective system that gets around the problem of that we have with our regulators like the ACCC and ATSIC just sitting back waiting for information to come to them and no one coming to them because they don't want to destroy their lives. So the policy case for a global artificial photosynthesis project. I've mentioned how justice, equity and respect for human dignity and environmental sustainability are emerging as primary social virtues, that nanotechnology needs a high public profile macro science project dedicated to them, that nanotechnology is the best candidate for use in this sense is artificial photosynthesis. It's a form of planetary therapeutics and fulfills the Millennium Development Goals. These are some other macro science projects that I've compared it with so that you can see the Human Genome Project, a very defined challenge, slightly different from fully characterising photosynthesis and improving on it. The CERN project with the Large Hadron Collider using big equipment, not quite the same as this project. The Hubble Space Telescope, similar. And ITER, the Fusion Energy Project. I mean, can you imagine fusion energy powering a sustainable world? For a start, you're going to have fusion reactors in every back garden. Are you going to have them in every country with big grids running? How is this fusion energy going to get around the planet? I mean, these sort of things suggest to me that even if they crack fusion energy, it's not a solution for a sustainable future. So this is a quick idea, giving you an idea of some of the macro science projects that currently exist. And this is what future generations will look back on as to where science had its head, what it was focused on in our generation. Yes, we had all these macro science projects. We were looking at the moon, we were looking out at space, we were looking, we were looking deep down into matter, but people will say, well, were they gazing at their navels? Meanwhile, the Earth was completely falling apart and they were gazing out in space and they were gazing at the quantum level. All very interesting, but meanwhile, the atmosphere and the species were dying. Why wasn't there a global artificial photosynthesis project capable of being an energy and climate change solution all in one? There are various models of collaboration that may draw it up, starting from regional centres of excellence, going out to national groups, coalescing, collaborations built from governance architectures through United Nations and UNESCO, starting with infrastructure and getting people in. All of these are mechanisms by which you could start to build a global project. This was the conference organised at Lord Howe Island to get people thinking about this. The plane goes around here and comes here. It's a very nice place. You've got to do these sort of conferences to get people out of the busy conference season in the US. Okay, so we'll get to the last two slides. Now, the Sustainocene, this term was coined by Brian here in 2012, so far as I'm aware. Now, the Sustainocene is a period where technology is powering the expansion of moral sympathy towards environmental sustainability as a fundamental social virtue, and it's backing a global network of local governance with communities being self-sufficient. In other words, it's undoing the model of corporate globalisation. This will be looked upon as a very strange sort of system of organising an economy, where you basically spend a lot of money for people like Gina Reinhardt to dig up rocks in one part of the world. You put them on big ships and send them right across to the other side of the world, where workers work at $2 a day to make trinkets that you put on big ships and drive them through the coral reefs back to the country where they sell them again. Now people think, well, what on earth were they doing? Look at all the round and round and round. Do we need to do this? Is this a sustainable model? Yes, it's making people a lot of money, but can you really say that this is going to be the model of how humans will interact with their environment for 1 billion years? The answer is no, of course they won't. They'll look back and think, oh, God, the Anthropocene, it'd be like, the period when Ricky Ponting was captaining Australia. What a strange period that was. Thank goodness we're out of the Anthropocene. Sorry, Ricky. He was a very good batsman, but I always had questions about his captaincy. Other features of will be rights of ecosystems that I've mentioned, how some of these are developing. That in the Sustainocene, you won't just be able to go down and chop down a tree. If you try and chop down a tree, you'll suddenly get all these people writing the same right. You'll end up in court the next day with all the people who are designated to protect the tree, right, and sue for the tree, right. And I think good. So they'll be preserving legacy fuels. I mean, people will need the oil, coal and gas in the future. There could be all sorts of disasters. The future generations may be really annoyed that, when they have some really huge sort of geological disaster or an asteroid disaster, we've used up all the fossil fuels and made it very hard for them to sustain the nucleus of humanity. All human structures will be contributing to the biosphere in the Sustainocene. So roads, bridges, houses, vehicles, all the things we make will be doing photosynthesis and contributing to the environment, and the Sustainocene must last over 1 billion years if we're actually going to repay our debt to life and stamp ourselves as ethical beings on this planet. So the last sort of slide really is this, is that drawing back to the beginning of the talk, here are some sort of statements. Reality, that macroscopic objects have real properties determining the outcomes of quantum mechanical measurements. That's a fundamental statement that people make, that locality, that the reality in one location is not influenced by measurements performed simultaneously at a distant location. Now, Bell's inequality, which is well known to physicists here, establishes that one of those assumptions is false. Now, how can that be reality? It's not common sense, and yet papers are coming out all the time, such as this one in Science, which is showing that it's nonetheless reality, even though it doesn't seem to make common sense that these two statements should be mutually inconsistent. Nonetheless, they are. So what we do is we live in a common sense world, right? We live in what's called a classical world. That really means that we work with ideas of Newtonian causation, not quantum causation. That's how we live. That's how we interact. And science is in that world, but at the same time, it's looking at these other worlds, that have got quantum characteristics, where the equations of general relativity and the equations of quantum mechanics mesh in 13 dimensions. And we presume that 13 dimensions is reality, or maybe 20 dimensions. It's not 4. We actually live in these, but we don't understand them because we live in the world through our senses. So what we're confronting, both in art, music, literature, and governance structures, I think, is that we're trying to replicate patterns of understanding and harmony in nature that we only dimly perceive through our senses. And so this is what's holding us back. And that's why it's making it so difficult to move ahead into something like the Sustainocene. But I think that global artificial photosynthesis, this is a conclusion, is the moral culmination of nanotechnology and is the best research prospect for addressing the critical public health and environmental problems of our time and to build a sustainable future. I think that global collaboration on artificial photosynthesis will critically accelerate the benefits of that field of science, and that effective global artificial photosynthesis collaborations and products will evolve spontaneously, but they will be facilitated by raising the field's public policy profile and addressing challenges such as market state policy influences, corporate fraud, intellectual monopoly privileges, such as patents, and trade and investment agreements. And if we can do that, we can start to move from a world with haves and have-nots, which has clearly depicted a nighttime view of energy, towards one where we have large populations which are also receiving power that's generated locally in their own houses. And once people have the capacity to generate power in their own villages, in their own houses, off-grid, by simply using sunlight to split even dirty water, absorb CO2, make basic starches, then those people can educate themselves. Once they do that, the population rate drops. They can start creating their own visions of peaceful communities. That is a vision for a sustainable world. That's a world that I think artificial photosynthesis has a major role in moving us towards, and I think the time is right to start developing a global project on artificial photosynthesis. Thanks very much.
There's a little time for a question or two. Will you please put your hand up if you want to ask a question and wait for the microphone?
That was very inspiring, thank you. And I don't want to put a dampener on all that idealism, but a lot of people now are saying that the thing that's going to stop us moving into a renewable energy world, or a Sustainocene, if you like, but is collapse of the banking sector. Now, that there may not be the money around to fund these projects, such as GAP. Do you have a comment on the viability of the banking sector?
Well, if you're asking me to say, should we bail out the banks, again, rather than put money into renewable energy, I would say no. Do we need global finance? Yes. I mean, this is why proposals like a global tax on financial transactions, I think if there is another banking collapse, then I think that's the gun you'd hold to their heads and say, we're fed up with you guys. A lot of these failures are simply due to speculative investments, greedy people putting money where they know it's not going to be a sound investment, and all the sort of shenanigans that we know went on with the last financial collapse and the one before that, that economists never seem to predict. So in that sort of situation, I think if that happens again, then I think that's the sort of crisis where you'd say we're fed up with this. It's not a sustainable model to have global finance continually disrupted by these booms and bust cycles, right? In the same way as we applied a GST in national economies to sort of even out the amount of money that governments were getting, we're going to do this on a global level. Where that goes and how you distribute it, fine. But at least then you would have money for education, health, research in science, and it would be stable. Because these people would keep moving money around and investing. You'd have a constant stream of money to keep public goods going, and then they could do their own investments. And look, there are good things that come from investments. We're encouraging investments in solar fuels, but if the banking sector keeps collapsing because it's essentially a lot of the collapse is because it's underregulated. And so that was the failure of the cargo cult of the market state. With people like Milton Friedman. The awful people like that, controlling public policy. So hopefully now that he's gone, his legacy will wane and we won't see the same sort of problems. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just curious, you had a lot of different research groups working on the synthetic photosynthesis. Are they working together, or are they sort of overlapping and competing?
Well, they're essentially competing. They're all funded by, most of the research groups, in fact all of them, they're funded by national research projects. So they put in bids through the national funders. I think what you can say, there is some specialisation going on amongst those groups. We're not doing exactly the same thing, but there's certainly a lot of overlap. And there's a lot of competition, because obviously they will want to get funded the next time. So are they going to share their insights with another group, particularly in their own country? No. I mean, particularly in one country, they're extremely competitive. But even with international groups, I mean, there's a certain amount of collaboration between groups based on individuals knowing each other and respecting and trusting each other, and so research collaborations build up. But I think part of what I'm trying to suggest is we've got to move beyond that. We have to create some sort of structure where these groups can start to coalesce. Doesn't mean you forget those groups. I mean, you could still have those groups existing, but they could co-opt senior members to a superarching structure designed to attract the best people to work on particular projects for short periods of time. There's all sorts of models, but I think we have to start thinking about that sort of process. I don't think there's one solution. I think the solutions will evolve spontaneously once you get these people together. So that's part of what my work's been involved with, is trying to get these people together. And I've been assisted by a lot of people here, such as Jan, for example, who was here when I first started getting some of the ideas together initially.
Sorry, I just wanted to also ask how far along, because you mentioned that the first question people ask is how far along the development research, but just how far along is it?
Well, look, a simple answer to that question is, groups like JCAP in the United States, the Joint Centre on Artificial Photosynthesis, Nate Lewis, as director, has said unequivocally, we have to develop a practical device within 2 to 3 years. That's our funding requirement. That's what we're going to do. We've narrowed down all our options. We're going down this one track. That's what we're going to do. Other areas of the problem, and that's to create a solar fuel, sort of split water to get hydrogen. The CO2 reduction problem is very, very difficult. That's not as close. It's a very, very difficult process, and it's not as close to a practical device.
Thanks, Thomas. I was just wondering if the whole system of our artificial photosynthesis is based around these metal atoms or metal catalysts, and we want to produce, like, as you plan, a global economy essentially on this. Wouldn't that drive the price up of these metals and elements quite a lot? And
yeah,
make
it would.
It, again, difficult for third world countries to deal with?
Yeah, well, that's been one of the main problems at the moment, is that the most efficient catalysts are rare earth metals, at least the ones that have been studied a lot. So ruthenium, iridium, and of course, Chinese have a monopoly. They're very expensive. And so a large thrust of the catalysis research has been to find robust, earth-abundant, environmentally stable catalysts. And that's why I said, at the moment, it seems to me that manganese, cobalt, and doped iron oxide are the 3 big contenders. There are a whole stack of others. In fact, you could see papers where they've listed, I don't know, it's hundreds, but many, many, many different types of catalysts that people are using, and mixtures, of alloys and things. I think those are the criteria that they're looking for. They have to be able to be rolled out across the planet, and so. But I think there is a certain reluctance to do life cycle analysis, because obviously a lot of these groups are looking to attract venture capital. And so they don't want to send the wrong sort of signals to investors that maybe their solution won't be rolled out. So they're a bit nervous, and that's the problem. How do you get funds from investors? And so I think this is another example of why the public sector has to lead the way to some extent to get the thing off the ground.
Yeah, just going back to the question of the reliability, durability of the financial system, my impression is that the reason why financial system appears to be failing is it's in essence driven by cheap fuel, cheap energy, and fossil fuels getting more and more expensive. So that what we really need to fix the banking system is cheap energy, which is what you were proposing. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, look, I spent too long because I think there's some other questions, but I think you're absolutely right. And it's the energy's cheap for a variety of reasons. One, and this was identified by the non-governmental organisations who led that sort of Twitter storm, at the beginning of the Rio summit, they decided to focus on one issue at the Rio summit, and that was reduction of subsidies for old photosynthesis fuels. Like, I don't think we should call them fossil fuel. They're old photosynthesis fuels. Let's call them what they are. Because otherwise people think, oh, it's fossil. Who cares? It's a silly old fossil. We'll burn it. It's old photosynthesis. It's a legacy, from this wonderful process. So that's one of the reasons, and then there's a whole stack of other, so that they're artificially low because of these subsidies. The carbon price isn't high enough, so we haven't actually. So there's this thing: you want to impose a carbon price that actually is high enough to drive investment, reduce the subsidies, and then how do you get rid of the lobbying? I mean, if you think the tobacco industry is a good lobbyist, wait till you hit the archive photosynthesis industry, the oil and gas companies. These are very, very powerful lobby interests. But at the same time, they're easy targets because you know what they're motivated by, greed and profit. So if you actually come up with a device that you can say, look, every single house in the world is going to want one of these, then you think, oh, well, some of them will say, well, I'm going to put my money on that because, that's where I'm going to make, you guys can puddle around in oil and gas, I'm heading off for artificial photosynthesis. And everybody's house is going to have my device. You'll get that sort of tension, and hopefully we can get the devices up to a stage where that starts rolling out. But we want it to happen equitably. That's why we're trying to get the United Nations and UNESCO interested in creating a sort of governance framework, where you declare photosynthesis common heritage first. So you get in there first and shape the governance architecture before the prairie gets enclosed, as you might say.
Hi, sir. Thank you very much for your talk. I found everything you said is really good. But what I think is that this technology is inevitably going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to be very expensive. So I'd just like to ask, how do you think we're going to overcome the problem of how to reduce the costs, and how we're going to get it worldwide and install it in all the...
Well, I could tell you a parable or a story. I think that's probably the best way to end it. It's a bit, when people say to me, should we do artificial photosynthesis through synthetic biology? I think it's a bit like the 19th century. You could imagine people thinking about how you do transatlantic travel in the 19th century. People would say, we're going to breed birds. We're going to breed huge albatrosses, right? And then we're going to get on their backs, and that's how we're going to fly across the Atlantic. Because, that was the mindset. That was the only way that the paradigm that they were locked into was that only birds can fly. So if you're going to go across the Atlantic, you have to breed huge albatrosses. The paradigm we're locked into at the moment is that only plants can do photosynthesis. We just assume only plants, that's what plants do. The revolution that's going to happen is the sudden understanding that we can do it, and we can do it better because we don't need the same amount of water. We can absorb all the photons and use them, whereas if the poor plants try and absorb all the photons, they fry themselves, so they can't do it. So we can do it for a whole stack of reasons. We can do it better. And I think it'll then be like it was in, say, the 1900s, where people look at the first couple of cars that are driving around on the roads, and they were saying, why would you want an expensive, smelly old car like that when you've got a horse? How are these sort of things going to spread across the planet? And yet, here we are, 100 years later, and almost every single human being of adult age has got at least one car, if not two. So I think once the technology starts going, there's exponential growth in efficiencies and so forth, and you'll see this, particularly if it's addressing major problems, and particularly if it's successful. So I think we're at this sort of challenging point now where I see the role of a presentation like this and the sort of interest you're getting is to really say, hey, stop looking at all these peripheral things and focus on the main game. Focus on a solution that has the potential to solve the energy, the climate change and the water problems. And if we do, then the costing will solve itself once we get enough energy focused on the problem.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your talk. I call it an oration, really. In Aristotle's time, he referred to virtue in Nicomachean ethics and virtue versus fraud, and you've been talking about economics versus ecology, and you're calling for a revolution. It took 150 years from Stephenson's rocket to very fast train. We just don't have that time left. And it seems to me that the key now is to communicate with politicians and industry to see if they can lever your utopianism into reality. But you've done something which many speakers don't do, and which is rather uncomfortable in a way. It's made us all think. And for that reason, I'd like to thank you very much for your talk.